92 teams in a footballing pyramid that goes back well over 100 years. But there's one side that stands above the rest as the oldest of them all: Nottingham Forest. In a city over 25 times smaller than the capital London, the Garibaldi alone have outshone the entire city's footballing achievements on multiple occasions. But having summited the mountain of world football in the late 70s, the fortunes of a club from the banks of the River Trent plummeted. For years, the hopes and dreams of Forest fans were shattered in front of their eyes, as the red shirts of the club went from signifying danger for the opposition to the bleeding out of a dying institution. Following campaign after campaign of mania and false dawns, Nottingham Forest found themselves bottom of the championship with just 1 point from the opening 7 and destined for the start of their third spell of third division football. But then, a man born in South Wales, who just left Swansea City in explosive fashion a few months previously, was brought into the club. 8 months later, and Nottingham Forest were a Premier League side once again. However, it wouldn't be a fairy tale return for the English footballing giants though, as after 11 games and just 1 win, they found themselves planted to the foot of the table. But then, Steve Cooper did it again. This is the story of how Nottingham Forest rose up, fell down, and then rose up once again. The 6th of January 1975. Elton John topped the Billboard Top 100. Football had entered the 9th year since England were champions of the world, and Stoke City were going neck and neck with Liverpool at the top of the First Division, in a title race that would result in then 5th place Derby County winning the league. But most importantly of all, Brian Clough joined Nottingham Forest, with the club finding themselves 13th place in the 2nd Division, just weeks after he'd left Leeds United, the reigning champions of the first tier. Forest would win their first game under Clough, before drawing 2-2 with the biggest team in world football, Leyton Orient. You'll never guess who I support. This draw would start an 11-game spell without a win, the side's worst run of the season, as the choice of second Alan Brown looked more and more risky as each game went by. But under the surface, something was brewing at the City ground. Clough was starting to instill his ideologies within his players, as the side finished the season with the 3rd best form in the league, managing a 16th place finish, followed by an 8th place one a year later. Fast forward another year to the 27th of April 1977, and Nottingham Forest had lost 2 games on a bounce, dropping down to 4th and out of the promotion spots, which they'd featured in for pretty much the entire year. With just 4 games left to save their season, Forest gave it everything. And in the end, 3 wins and a draw were enough to see them scrape into 3rd place, and therefore the First Division, by just 1 point. Going into the new campaign, many outside of Nottingham were sceptical of this Forest side, but Clough and his assistant Peter Taylor believed in themselves and the squad. It took just 2 games for Forest to reach the top of the league, and from the 4th of October onwards, they wouldn't be knocked off their perch for the rest of the season, winning the title at the first time of asking, and going unbeaten from the 20th of November onwards. Of course, with this victory came qualification for the European Cup. However, following this success was arguably the most important sale in the club's history. Having been top scorer in both of Forest's 2 successful seasons, Peter White fell out with boss Brian Clough, and so come August 1978 was sold to Newcastle for £200,000. This loss of their top scorer hindered Forest massively, scoring just 1 goal from their opening 4 games and drawing 6 of their opening 7 before their first ever European Cup game, where they'd faced none other than the reigning champions Liverpool. The Scousers were top of the league and favourites for the competition, so going into the tie the media had pretty much written off Forest completely. Yet within 87 minutes of the first leg, the Garibaldi were 2-0 up, an aggregate lead they would see all the way through until full time at Anfield 2 weeks later, as Forest became the first side to knock Liverpool out of the competition in 3 years. In the second round, they went on to beat AEK Athens 7-2 on aggregate, where there'd then be a 5-month gap before their next European game against Grasshopper Zurich, who they'd beat 5-2 across 2 legs to reach the semis. In said semis, they'd be hosting Cologne of Germany first, coming back from 2-0 down to lead 3-2, before conceding an equaliser in the last minutes of the game, meaning it was all tied up heading into Germany on the 25th of April. After a battle over the 90 minutes in Cologne, Nottingham Forest won 1-0 thanks to an Ian Bowyer goal as they booked their ticket for the final. Now, one thing I haven't mentioned throughout all of this is that in February, Nottingham Forest had finally brought in their man up top to replace Wife who'd left in the summer, and so becoming the most expensive player of all time and the first £1 million player ever. Trevor Francis joined Nottingham Forest from Birmingham City, however hadn't scored a single goal in their European Cup run, due to the fact for the large majority of it, UEFA had deemed him ineligible to play as he was a mid-season transfer. I guess it was written in the stars then for the first £1 million player to score the first and only goal in Nottingham Forest's first ever European Cup final, and over 110 years since being founded, Forest lifted their biggest accomplishment yet, as they were crowned champions of Europe. A year later, they'd made the final again, this time at the legendary Santiago Bernabeu, against more prestigious European opponents Hamburg, who'd been crowned champions of Germany various times over the years, as well as winning the Cup Winners' Cup just a few years previously. It may have been different opposition, in a different stadium, in a different year, But for Forest, the outcome stayed the same, winning 1-0 and therefore retaining their European glory. However, this European glory had plastered over injuries with this Forest side, which proved to be the start of their decline pretty much straight after reaching the top. Following their second place finish in '79, Forest would drop down to 5th in 1980 until relied on their European Cup triumph to qualify the next season, where they'd then be knocked out in the first round. Within just a couple years, many stars of this side had left, and Peter Taylor retired as assistant manager, leading to many questioning how capable Clough would be in succeeding without his right-hand man. Well, despite never reaching the level of glory that he had with Taylor beside him, Clough would still guide the side to another few top 3 finishes in the league, as well as twice more winning the League Cup, with Forest consistently reaching top half finishes for pretty much his entire time at the club. And so going into the first Premier League season ever, Forest were an outside tip for making Europe. However, after some poor transfer business and Clough's worsening health, it became obvious fairly quickly that Europe wouldn't be a possibility. Forest lost 6 of their 7 opening games and won just 3 up until 1993, where despite a bit of hope with an upturn in form, they fell back into the bad habit of losing, and come the 1st of May 1993, with an entire game left to play, Nottingham Forest became the first side ever relegated from the Premier League. Clough was in tears after the game, with a loss 1-0 later to Ipswich being his final ever match as manager, retiring at the end of his worst season ever. Having joined the club in the 2nd Division 18 years earlier, Brian Clough achieved it all with Forest, becoming to this day the greatest manager to ever grace the city. Funny enough, Frank Clark, one of Clough's first signings for Forest, then took over as manager, dragging them back up to the Premier League at the first attempt, before a good start to the season had them top the table after 4 games, with the club going on to finish 3rd and qualifying for the UEFA Cup. However, this campaign was a false sense of hope for the Forest faithful, as the next season they'd be knocked out early in Europe, finish 8th, and watch on as the following campaign they found themselves in the relegation zone after 10 games, and would yet again finish bottom, dropping down to the Championship. And now, you're not going to believe this. Forest did another yo-yo, being promoted instantly once again, and then you guessed it, being relegated in 1999 in a 3rd bottom place finish since 1993. But this time, Forest wouldn't come back up. An uninspiring run of 4 mid-table finishes from 5 seasons came to a close in 2004-05, where Nottingham Forest were relegated to League One. A 7th place finish in their first campaign prevented the rot, before a 4th place finish and playoff run came in 2006-07. The Garibaldi beat Yeovil 2-0 away in the first leg and were cruising through to Wembley, before a remarkable collapse at the City Ground saw them concede 5 goals in 120 minutes of football, being knocked out after extra time, with Forest fans in disbelief. It would then be a bumpy start to the season in 07-08, with no wins from the opening 4 games. However, once they hit form in September, they didn't stop winning, closing out the season with 6 wins from 7 and secured promotion in 2nd place. They managed to stay up in 19th in 2009 before building over the summer, and found themselves in 2nd place going into 2010, with the promised land of the Premier League in touching distance, having been in the deep dark pit of the EFL for over a decade. Their form would drop off in the second half of the season though, but were still able to manage a 3rd place finish and found themselves just 1 playoff campaign away from reaching the top tier. But after conceding 3 goals in 7 minutes in the second leg, overturning what had been a Forest comeback at the City Ground, they were defeated by Blackpool twice, losing 6-4 in aggregate. Despite the heartbreak though, manager Billy Davies chose to stay over the summer, giving them foundations to work on for the next campaign, with another playoff place finish resulting in back-to-back semi-final losses to the side that would go on to be promoted, losing to Swansea 3-1, with the Garibaldi looking like a cursed side. Throughout this period, Forest fan Nigel Doughty owned the club and was their chairman up until October 2011, where he stepped down following backlash from fans as the club failed to recover from losing Davies over the summer, finding themselves in 21st in the league. In spite of this disappointing campaign, Doughty had been a solid figure at the club for years, which offered them stability and helped them to recover from serious financial issues they faced in the 90s, which is why it would be a complete shock in February 2012 when tragically Doughty passed away, aged just 54. Forest then managed to claw themselves out of the relegation zone come the end of the season, finishing 19th and setting themselves up for a successful campaign. As the next season the club flirted with the playoffs all the way through to December, when Famaz Al-Hassawi, who'd bought the club over the summer, took over as chairman and decided to sack manager O'Driscoll on Christmas Day, with the club's CEO intervening and refusing to allow it to happen until Boxing Day, just hours after the club saw victory against Leeds. This would be the start of an absolute manager merry-go-round at Nottingham Forest. By the end of the season, 4 managers had come and gone, with Billy Davies being brought back in March, managing to make it nearly an entire year in charge, before, you guessed it, got sacked again. By the end of the 2016-17 season, 9 managers had been at Forest in just 4 years under Famaz, with the club seeing worse league finishes year after year. And then finally on the 18th of May 2017, with the side having secured safety on the final day of the season with a 3-0 win against Ipswich, Famas sold the club to Greek businessman Evangelos Marinakis, who turned out to be just as bonkers with managers. In fact, from 1993 all the way through to the conclusion of the 2018-19 season, Forest pretty much had a manager a season. There'd be 31 changes of managers in 26 years at the City ground before the most bonkers appointment of all took place in Sabri Lamouchi. Lamouchi brought 21 players in over the summer, and many Forest fans were sceptical as to what was about to happen, as they'd finally built up to a strong 9th place finish the season before. 11 games in, and Forest was second, as the fans fell in love with the team and staff. The likes of Lamouchi, Samba and Joe Lolly had become fan favourites, and with the owner willing to splash the cash, for the first time in years, it felt like they might just be on their way back to the Premier League. And despite a severe drop in form after the pandemic and loss of fans in the stadium, going into the final day, Forest were in a hugely strong position, in which all they needed was 1 point or to lose and see a swing of just 5 goals or less in order to reach the playoffs. And in something you couldn't write yourself, 2 last-minute goals in both games affecting Forest went against the Garibaldi, with Nuno da Costa's last moment in a Forest shirt being an own goal to knock them down to 7. Lamouchi's time in Nottingham would never recover from this setback, and after being backed with another 24 signings, they lost their opening 4 matches to the season, and the manager was dismissed. Replacing him would be the experienced Chris Hughton, who'd already got both Newcastle and Brighton promoted out of the division, and so hopes were high for fans of the Garibaldi that he may have what it takes to bring them up. However, Hughton's Forest never really got going, and after never winning more than 2 games in a row, they finished in an underwhelming 17th place before an absolutely atrocious start to the next season. 7 games, 6 losses, 12 goals conceded, and rooted to the bottom of the table. This was Forest's worst start to a season ever. And so, as I mentioned earlier, Steve Cooper came in. From the second the Welshman joined the club, it felt like he matched just what the side stood for, and was exactly what they needed. He managed to turn their season round, qualified them for the playoffs, and after getting the most out of youngsters like Jed Spence and Brendan Johnson, he'd guided them to a 2-1 lead over Sheffield United going into the return fixture in the playoff semi-final. 19 minutes in, and Brendan Johnson scored again for Forest, putting them 3-1 up on aggregate and securing their place in the playoff final. Nah, I'm lying. This is Forest we're talking about. Following half-time, the event exploded. Gibbs White equalised on the night just after the break, and Fleck sent the game to extra time after a late goal for the Blades, where following a tense but goalless 30 minutes, the clash went to pens. With a score 3-2 to the Garibaldi, Joe Lolly stepped up with the opportunity to put Nottingham Forest just 90 minutes away from the Premier League, but then he blazed his shot over the bar. And just when you thought you'd seen it all, Bryce Samba, in what might have been his final game for the club, saved Morgan Gibbs White's penalty, with the keeper being the hero on the night for the Garibaldi, as they went one huge step closer to returning to the promised land. Over 80,000 people lined Wembley Way, as on the 29th of May, Huddersfield faced up against Nottingham Forest for a place in the Premier League. And you know how this story goes. Nottingham Forest won 1-0, and in just 8 months at the club, Steve Cooper healed the pain which had been deeply rooted in the fans of the club spanning 4 different decades. And by now, you know the drill. 26 new faces entered the City ground, with many pundits saying it was a recipe for disaster. But I don't think many of their fans would have cared about what anyone else thought, as they were back. A loss to Newcastle on the opening day would quickly be forgotten about, as the City ground hosted Premier League football for the first time this millennium, and Forest saw a 1-0 triumph, but it wouldn't be long before things started to go downhill. Going into the 22nd of October, Forest hadn't won a single game in any competition since late August, and faced up against the most successful side in English history, in Liverpool. However, if we rewind all those years to Brian Clough's tenure at the club, and Forest were a real bogey team for the Scouse Reds, and with the spirit of their former manager throwing through the stadium that day, the Garibaldi did the impossible and beat Liverpool. A couple weeks later, and they'd also beat Spurs in the League Cup, followed up by a win against Crystal Palace going into the World Cup, with the club breaking free from the bottom of the Premier League after seemingly being destined for their 4th straight finish there in the Prem. And since the start of the new year, Forest have been nothing short of sensational. A draw against Chelsea, followed up by 2 wins against Southampton and Leicester, has seen Forest rise all the way up to 13th in the table, with the signings finally starting to gel and Steve Cooper working his magic. Not only this, but they once again saw success on penalties, this time in the Carabao Cup, where they've reached the semi-finals, coming up against Manchester United. And with the start to the season having almost resembled Clough's start to life in Nottingham, the side in Garibaldi Red might just be destined to lift the trophy he'd won more than any other. Thanks for watching. Sorry if I skimmed over a few bits in this video. I just didn't want to go into too much depth about anything, particularly in Clough's time at the club, as I'd love to do a follow-up video at some point. Please like and subscribe if you're new, and most importantly, enjoy your day.